from Washington. This is Fred Starr. I'm chairman of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute, and we have a really very significant gathering of minds this morning, experts from and on Kyrgyzstan, who are going to ask this question. There are plenty of symptoms, but what's the disease and how to cure it? In other words, what's been going on there and what's going to be going on in the coming period. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but we have some very wise people. Let me briefly introduce the entire group, and then in the course of our discussion, you'll hear from all of them and have a chance to put questions to them. First, Azimov, founder and CEO of Media Kitchen in Bishkek. He's a very widely known and well-regarded political commentator. Like all the speakers this morning, he's part of our CAMCA network. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Almazbek Beishenaliev, who is now, we're all proud to say, Minister of Education and Science of the Kyrgyz Republic. He is the founder and director of the Regional Institute of Central Asia in Bishkek, and of course, a CAMCA network member. We'll then hear from Zarina Chekirbaeva, who is a candidate for the Parliament of the Kyrgyz Republic from the Birbol political party. She's a former executive director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Kyrgyzstan, and like all our speakers, a CAMCA network member. Then Johan Engvall. He is a researcher at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, a senior fellow at the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program, and the author of a very highly regarded book, which the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute published on the issue of corruption in that country. Finally, we're going to hear from Talant Sultanov, founder and chairman of the Kyrgyz chapter of the Internet Society. He is a real specialist on social media and technology, and I hope he'll focus on those questions because it's very much part of the story. He's an expert at the Center for Strategic Initiatives in Bishkek and a CAMCA network member. I should say CAMCA, a word about CAMCA. CAMCA is an organization created by fellows who have participated in the joint program of the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and the Rumsfeld Foundation. And they got together as alumni of that program and continue to hold their annual big meeting, which is now the kind of, if you will, World Economic Forum of Central Asia. And they continue to be in touch with each other among all the countries of Central Asia, Caucasus, Mongolia, and Afghanistan. It is a remarkable network of younger talent, and I think we're all very fortunate to be able to turn to members of that network for these reports this morning. Let me start then with Azim Azimov. You're on, sir.
Dear Dr. Starr, dear panelists, dear colleagues, thank you very much for this privilege and opportunity to speak on this distinguished panel. And as you, Dr. Starr, mentioned, we really have seen various and multiple symptoms, and yet we are here to determine, or at least try to determine, what the disease is. And this seems to be as a hard task because there's so much so many dimensions to what's going on. And so maybe I will try, in my opening remarks, I will try to have a look at the ongoing process from three different perspectives. So the first perspective being elections, parliamentary elections that we had in October this year, which served as a trigger for this whole process. The second thing to have a view on is we'll try to define what has happened when President Jeenbekov stepped down and we now have established a new acting president, Sadir Japarov. So whether this was a revolution, was the coup, or was the forceful takeover of power, and whereas and whether any criminal or other illegal forces have been in act. And the third thing, maybe it may be curious to actually have see all of these events from the perspective of geopolitics, and because we saw how Russia was involved and whether there is a geopolitical aspect to it. And so starting from the elections, so as you all know, this whole process has begun after October 4th, when around a dozen of political parties who were unsatisfied with the results of the parliamentary elections, they took it to the streets. But they took it to the streets firstly in a very peaceful manner. So we had around 10 political parties, a member and candidate of one of which is Zarina Chekirbaeva. And so, thousands of people gathered on main square of Bishkek. And the whole vibe of those events were quite positive. There were only peaceful slogans. Everybody were holding signs and banners with peaceful slogans and all that. And suddenly, closer to tonight, all these events took a more at that moment not violent but very determined turn. So part of the protesters took it to the White House and tried to take it by force. And then what happened then was there was a riot police that tried to oppose them, and they were defeated, and so they left. And we have seen the rest of the story. But the main thing here that I would want to distinguish and specify is that even though elections have acted as a trigger to these events, it's not because of the elections why President Jeenbekov stepped down. And it's not because of the elections that Sadir Japarov, who was not even a candidate, even though he is a co-chair of one of the parties, that he came to power. So again, in my opinion, what happened was elections and this widespread dissatisfaction with their results, created the situation where law enforcement was demoralized, when the government was not able to kind of show their decisiveness. And so in this very fragile and vulnerable moment, certain forces, certain political actors, they were more determined and they were more decisive, and that's how we came here. And so that leads us to my second point in trying to actually define what has happened. And when I was approached by, for instance, Russian media, and in early October, they asked me whether this was a revolution or like whatever this was at that time. My main talking point that I always used was that we are just in the beginning of the process. And so to say that this is a revolution, you need time, because revolution means you have an end result. And even though we're still, well, not early, but quite early in the process, I think we can, right now give our kind of preliminary judgment of what happened. And so in my opinion, what happened was, it was not a revolution. And the reason I'm saying this is not a revolution, because, if this was a revolutionary force that was behind, these changes, then they would, declare the government, the parliament, and all other institutions illegitimate, and establish their own legitimate bodies. And I think that would, kind of qualify more and better for revolution. In my opinion, what happened was, there were certain political forces that took over the existing regime. They, beheaded it and tried to install their own head. And so, and they advocated for, preserving the legitimacy of this whole, government and, state of all state and government bodies, and try to govern with existing infrastructure. And therefore, in my opinion, this was not a civic and political movement that led to President Jeenbekov stepping down. This was not a revolution where, new revolutionary political forces would come and declare all other illegitimate and, establish their new order. I think this was a forceful takeover of the power when, certain political group that was quite violent and very aggressive and very decisive. And so what happened was they took over the government and then the parliament, and using intimidation, using threats, and using all other borderline illegal or maybe even illegal means, they established their own rule and order. And from that point on, what they're trying to do now, for better or worse, they're trying to legitimize their rule. And so right now we have a government that was legitimized and appointed by the parliament. We have the same parliament that resided for the last 5 years, and so those are the MPs that we voted for. And so on the first look, we have legitimate governing bodies in Kyrgyzstan. But the thing is, they have been taken over and then beheaded, and now are being run using somewhat forceful measures. And so the last point before I continue my opening remarks is, as I mentioned before, the geopolitical aspect of this whole thing. So one thing that international observers might have been most interested in is how the representative of the Russian government, Kozak, came to Kyrgyzstan, and so he had his negotiations with former President Jeenbekov. And we know that at certain stage of these negotiations, current acting president Sadir Japarov also was present. And so whereas the content of this whole negotiation still is a mystery to Kyrgyz citizens, which is very worrisome to start with, we can now say again, we can make our preliminary kind of judgments and conclusions. So first of all, from the statements of the Russian Federation and also from statements of other countries and unions like European Union or Great Britain, we know that the international community that Kyrgyzstan most closely cooperates with, they wanted to have Sooronbay Jeenbekov as they saw him as a legitimate president, and they wanted to keep him that way. So he was a point of contact for the international community. However, that did not stop Sadir Japarov's supporters to forcefully oust him. Well, technically, President Jeenbekov stepped down voluntarily, but we as Kyrgyz citizens, we have observed what happened, and we know that it was forceful. So he was not left with any other options. And so what strikes me here as an observer is the fact that it's a very rare occasion when Russia sends their high-profile representative to Kyrgyzstan, and they make it very clear that they have their bet on Jeenbekov. There's this word stavlenik, or сделать ставку, and so we know that Russia wanted Jeenbekov to stay, and yet it did not stop these other political actors from ousting him. And so on one hand, one may wonder like whether Russia is not as influential as it has been always in Kyrgyzstan, or whether this new government does not want to cooperate with Russia. But I don't think that's the case. But again, at the same time, I'm very hesitant to say that this was a kind of like triumph of Kyrgyz sovereignty. There is an indirect enormous amount of indirect evidences where we can say that the new current elites in Kyrgyzstan are more interested in cooperating with Chinese capital. And so you may have heard about how there is this whole empire of a bootlegger, of a guy with a nickname of a million. And even though he is not a formal political figure in Kyrgyzstan or in the region, what we know for sure is that there is this guy who has his illegal empire that feeds off of loopholes, or not loopholes, but of holes within European Economic Union. And so that organization is not interested in having money that they can earn from European Economic Union, but they're more interested in having their financial streams going from China to Uzbekistan. And so again, this is not a geopolitical theory, and please don't quote me on that. But what we are observing right now is, I think, a little shift, which may not be a shift in the government's development vector, but is a certainly shift from the perspective of current elites, where they're not financially dependent directly on Kremlin or official Moscow, whereas they are more dependent on their business ties, sometimes shady business ties, with China and Uzbekistan. And so these are my preliminary conclusions. So again, the events are changing every day, and we're seeing, we're receiving more news, and then they get outdated before they are reported. And so we are observing, attempts to do constitutional reform. And so again, we're not early in the process, but we are in the process. And so to give final definitions and then final resolutions to like everything that's going on, I think we need more time. But but some of my preliminary conclusions I have laid out to you.
Thank you very much. We've heard directly from the Media Kitchen institution which you founded and had. Bravo. Let me ask Dr. Beishenaliev, would you prefer to go now in alphabetical order, or would you, since you're a member of the government, would you like to comment at the end?
No, I'd like to talk now, if it's
You're
okay.
on. Okay,
Yes.
Dr. Beishenaliev.
So, hi everybody. So I'd like to talk from two perspectives, academic and a little bit formal. So I'd like to talk also the chronological story of the situation. On October 4th, 2020, in Kyrgyzstan, parliamentary elections were held. The elections were held according to party lists. Out of 16 parties, only the 4 parties have overcome the 7% threshold. The other 12 parties disagreed with the results. The results were dubious because 2 parties won half of the electorate's votes. One of these parties was headed by the president's brother, younger brother, Almazbek Jeenbekov. The second was headed by the shadow magnate, as my friend mentioned, Raim Matraimov. He is popularly nicknamed as Raim Million, the creator of corruption schemes of customs. The Central Elections Commission's approved the voting results, and the President Zoran Jeenbekov issued a statement that the cleanest and most honest elections were held in the country. The electorate did not agree with this. On October 5th, leaders of 5 parties began to protest together with their supporters. Representatives of the other 4 parties joined the protesters. By the evening of October 5th, special force soldiers arrived at the square. There were around 20,000 people. Protesters demanded to cancel the result of election. The law enforcement agencies opened fire with rubber bullets and flashbang grenades. So water cannons were used. On the night of October 5th to October 6th, people stormed the White House. President left the building secretly. So he announced that he would meet with party leaders in the morning. On October 6th, the protesters released Almazbek Atambayev, our ex-president, early morning. After Sadir Japarov was released from prison, now he is exiting as a prime minister of the country, and a group of detainees were released from other places of detention for corruption cases. Judges made decisions to release him immediately as requested. At the point in time, President Jeenbekov did not arrive for a meeting with the protesting party leaders. The Central Election Commission announced that the election results were cancelled. So a group of deputies of the Jogorku Kengesh, our parliament, 1/3 of 120 people, gathered one of the hotels, accepted the resignation of Speaker Dastan Jumabekov, elected a new speaker, Mukhtibek Abduldayev, and approved Sadir Japarov as a prime minister. All these decisions were made without a quorum. The heads of the law enforcement agencies, like Minister of Internal Affairs, State Committee for National Security, Security Council, or General Prosecutor's Office, left their jobs and field. Prime Minister Boronov and his first deputy Asrandiev wrote applications for resignation and left the governmental house. So the country was left without power. At the moment, General Ömürbek Subhanaliyev, Deputy Security of the Security Council, took over coordinating the power structures. And he appointed General Kursan Asanov as the coordinator of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. and the two of them carried out of the protest the city from looters and criminals, formed a people's squad and managed to take control of the situation. So in the course of the riots, one person died and around 600 were among the victims. On October 7th and 8th, the country was in the atmosphere of a rally of thousands of supporters of Sadr Japarov, who demanded to give him all the reins of government. They demanded the immediate resignation of president and demanded that Johor Kengesh Parliament should already appoint Japarov as a prime minister in full composition. On October 9th, there was a clash between supporters of Sadr Japarov and a united group of supporters of Almazbek Atambayev, ex-president, and Ömürbek Babanov, one of the party leaders. The victory was won by Japarov's side. On that day, Atambayev and his convicted team were arrested and returned to their cells. General Kursan Asanov was also arrested along with them, which surprised the public because they declared him the organizer of the riots, although he was among the few who ensured order within 3 rebellious days. The president declared a state of emergency in the country, and on the outskirts of the city, a checkpoint from army units was set up on 4 sides. On October 9th, the Johor Kengesh Parliament gathered 51 people. 61 was required for a quorum, and he approved Sadr Japarov as a prime minister. Speaker Abdullayev was resigned. The protesters did not calm down, and they continued to demand the president's resignation. On October 13th, the president stated that he could not sign the decree on appointment of Japarov as a prime minister. In response to this, the crowd of many thousands gathered near the residence of the president, ready to rush to storm the residence. The situation has escalated. So on October 14th, Johor Kengesh Parliament gathered already in a quorum, so 83 deputies, and approved by Prime Minister Sadr Japarov for the 3rd time. On the same day, the president signed a decree on his appointment, but the demand for the president's resignation was not withdrawn. There was a threat of a clash between them and the troops at the approach to the city. On October 15, President Sooronbay Jeenbekov officially announced that his resignation. He was motivated by the fact that he could not allow bullshit in the country that was responsible for life of every citizen. On October 16, in the state residence, there was a session of state activists, deputy corps, members of government, Jeenbekov and Japarov. Speaker of Parliament, Kanat Isayev, he was elected 2 days ago, officially resigned from his duties as a head of state. After resignation of the president, the duties are transferred to speakers under the constitution. So after such a step, the duties of the president were transferred to Sadr Japarov, the head of the government, as prescribed by the constitution. So from that moment, he became a full-fledged head of government. He now has ensured that holding of repeat elections to the parliament not later than in 2 months, as well as clearly presidential election not later than 3 months. Its chronology of the 2 weeks during which the change of power took place in Kyrgyzstan. It's the 4th time in 15 years. The first 2 was 2005 and 2010. The presidents fled. The first one is to Moscow. The second one is to Minsk. The 3rd time, the president ruled the country for 6 years, handed over power to the next national elected one. But then was arrested on the case of illegal release of criminal authority and received as a prison sentence. The 5th president in 3 years of governing the country, 6 years under the constitution, voluntarily resigned after a wave of protest of the electorate at the parliamentary elections. The president's mistake was that he did not prevent his younger brother from participating in the elections as the leader of the pro-power party, which received the majority of votes. The president also failed to make progress with the materials that were presented to him on the episodes of corrupt activities of Raim Matraimov, which I mentioned about, whose political party took the second place in the elections by the number of votes. Against this background, the president tried to convince citizens that he had provided the fairest elections. The fact of life were faced with the illusion of the head of state. The compromise turned out to be impossible. Kyrgyzstan chose the path without such a president. By this, Kyrgyzstan entered another new page in the history of world geopolitics. This time, the country acquired a fully empowered and full-fledged ex-president. All previously elected presidents were officially deprived of the status. Between the second and the third president, fourth president, Rosa Otunbayeva served as a head of state for a year and a half. So this is the chronological situation of in Kyrgyzstan. Thank you. Dr. Starr, microphone.
Thank you very, very much. This is a very timely, valuable, important chronological overview. We hope that it will appear in print. It's very, very useful. And if there are any corrections to be made to it, I'm sure our other panelists will offer them to you. But on the other hand, I'm confident that it's quite authoritative. We're now going to turn to Zarina Chekirbaeva. Zarina she's on the front line. She's been involved very closely in every phase of this as a political figure, a member of the Birbal party and a candidate for the parliament. She, as we've heard, was on the street earlier and can give us firsthand impressions and her personal conclusions. Zarina.
Thank you, Dr. Starr. Good evening, well, from Bishkek time, I guess. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I think Azim and Almaz have shared a lot of already kind of background information plus what is currently happening. My perspective would be more as a candidate running for the parliament. From one of the political parties that's been so-called renewed, refreshed, because that's what we've been preaching throughout the whole campaign. Before I talk about the political party, just to give the background on how this whole elections were taking place, given that we had little time to prepare, to run a campaign, given that we were not immune. Kyrgyzstan wasn't, didn't have the immunity to coronavirus, so it hit us badly as well. We had lots of deaths. The system, the healthcare system was not ready to face all the challenges, just like I think everywhere else. But there were too many, layers of issues that kind of were exposed throughout the whole process, and there were even debates or discussions whether or not the election should be held this year or next year, because it was already limiting a lot of our possibilities of even running a campaign, for instance. But despite that, the Central Election Commission, so let's say a blessing of the president, made a decision to hold the elections on October 4th. The campaign commenced on September 4th, so we had 1 month to run our campaign, which is usually given, but we had a little time to prepare before that. But nevertheless, all political parties were limited in all other activities that they were exposed in the past, such as gathering big amount of, let's say, just big crowds, or using other tools to run their campaign. So a lot of us used social media a lot. We used a lot all other channels that could somehow reach out to our electorate. But still the decree was allowing us to gather still no more than 50 people. So I used that opportunity as a candidate in the district that I was responsible for, in meeting people and talking to people. So to be honest, in the past, I was always the part of the elections as an independent observer, or I was always helping out to independent, so-called international observers. So the perspective was a bit different in the past, and I think the violations even that took place, let's say back in 2002 or 2005, we were different than the violations were that took place this time around. But as a candidate, I got to see all the insights of what it's like to work with the electorate, what it's like to run a campaign, and what it's like when how electorate is manipulated, by different tools, by different parties. And I think in our election system, we always experience this so-called administrative pressure when so-called pro-governmental political parties always use this their administrative resource to put pressure on government officials, either to work for them during the campaign or to vote for them during the campaign. So this time around was no different. So the same administrative resource was heavily used. People working for different government institutions, including educational institutions such as universities and schools, were totally working for this pro-governmental, or the main, at least, political party. They've been collecting passports so they can register people who will definitely vote for this political party. To some extent, some of the procedures which were illegal, I think to some extent were legalized, and I think the anger that came out, from 12 political parties the next day after the night of the elections, or the following, led to the protest the following day, or with the violations that were legalized, to be honest. So one of them was this so-called Form 2. Basically, this would allow for any voter to re-register himself or herself from that poll district to another one. So I could be based in Bishkek, and by using Form 2, register myself somewhere in the district. Because we have to understand that I think either Azim or Almaz mentioned that one of the requirements for the political party to get into the parliament is you have to pass the 7% threshold. And it's true also that you need to collect that you have to collect 0.7% from each region as well. So when political party already knows that they won't collect enough, let's say, votes in one of the districts, they've beautifully used this Form 2 to move voters from one place to another. It was the beauty of it was that the voters were not moved from one village to another, but they were moved from one oblast or from one region to another region where they had to commute, let's say, for 7 hours or 10 hours. And this Form 2 was used for over 500,000 people. I mean, imagine this so-called internal tourism, how well it was developed during the the election period, because over 500,000 people were moving through Form 2 around the country in order to vote in a certain district. And that was one of the things that I think created a lot of the fuss among the political parties, because you can assume who would use that kind of tool in order to get more votes, and it was mainly the government officials that were moved from one place to another, or it was used by political parties that had lots of financial resources in order to basically locate people as they wished. So in that sense, Form 2 was one of the I think biggest issues, and it was very obvious before the final results came out. It was so obvious that over 500,000, 50,000 votes would already put 60, let's say around 60 seats in the parliament. So it was obvious that two big political parties basically split right before the results were announced. They split the number of seats in the parliament. So all they had to do is, let's say, collect the remaining whatever they need in order to get to be the majority, let's say, in the parliament. So when I was kind of running my campaign in the villages, I mean, I would hear that I was the only one, or if I was the first and the only candidate, or the only political party that was coming to their village or to their region to run a campaign, because all other parties, and I'm talking mainly about the big parties, they already knew in advance they had votes in that particular village or in that particular city. Because if I was always amused when I was visiting every single village that, you know, throughout the history of the village, you know, for last whatever number of years, they always had, let's say, 300 voters. And all of a sudden, out of 300, 100 voters were moved from that village to, let's say, to my hometown. And then you hear that the additional 500 voters were moved from Jalalabad, which is like, God, like whatever, 12 hours away from the village, in order to make sure that, you know, 500 people will definitely vote for one particular party. And it was true for every single village. And it was amazing how, you know, the financial resources were used. And we've been, I think, one of the accusations that were given by observers as well, that, you know, the people or parties were buying votes. Either Form 2 was one of the tools, another one was buying votes. Literally, they would, with the Form 2, they were promised, or they were given 1,000 sols, which is what about what is it, $12, and they were promised to get another $12 after they vote. So because one way is, you know, one thing is to get registered, another thing on the day of the elections you have to still come back to that district in order to vote. So it was kind of a double work, to be honest, and the people managed to do that. So I mean, people meaning that the political parties took courage, took time, spent resources in order to do that. And another one was basically when I was campaigning, you know, I was approached by the voters asking how much I'm going to give them, you know, to get their vote. And I thought this is, of course, in the beginning I was so disappointed. I thought, you know, why? I thought this pandemic or the whole situation, when they saw that how much our government screwed up and in healthcare system, in the educational system, you would assume that people would consciously approach these elections differently. And there was the belief, because the last parliament, or the current parliament, the sixth parliament, is considered and has been known for illiterate speeches, for lots of actual flaws. And you, by default, assume that people should by now ready to elect, you know, educated, you know, the experienced, and people who are brave enough to change the system, who are brave enough to break the system, etc. And you would also assume that the pandemic would also teach some lessons for people to reconsider their values, reconsider their stance on whom they should be finally electing. But unfortunately, I've witnessed myself, I saw it almost every single poll that I was cruising around on the day of the elections, that people themselves were, you know, I guess, you know, the responsible people, I guess, were running around with a list of voters. They were giving money as the voters were going into the poll, what's called the voting the booth, and as they were coming out, they were, you know, giving money, and that's when makes you more disappointed in the system, that, you know, people were actually selling their votes for 2,000 soms or for 5,000 soms, which is what about, again, $25 or a bit more. And because there was this hunger to some extent in the society, that, you know, they want now educated people, they want better representatives of their society in the parliament, they want this, you know, better MPs than the previous ones. But regardless, I think I was trying to come up with the excuses why people acted in the way as they acted. Because to be honest, it was they made their choice. It wasn't that they were forced, because they took money and they very responsibly voted for that particular party. You know, to some extent, you're like, okay, this is where the responsibility comes out, right? But before that, they don't even think, you know, that, okay, this is today, but what's going to happen tomorrow? You know, what kind of decision should be made after tomorrow? You know, what kind of future I want for my children or for my grandchildren? But those kind of, and I think as I was campaigning, I learned very quickly that, you know, by 80% or 90% of the population, at least that I was visiting, already knew in advance which political party they were going to vote. So the only thing I had left, to be honest, for myself is to say, all right, you got the money. I understand the pandemic hit you very hard, and I understand you might lack some financial resources, but I was trying to preach that as you walk into the, you know, voting booth, it's only you and the bulletin. You know, there's no one to watch or videotape you, because a lot of them were threatened that they would be videotaped, you know, how they vote, etc. So I was trying to tell them that, like, you shouldn't be worried, you shouldn't be scared of, or you shouldn't have any fear of, you know, someone or, you know, watching or taping, etc. Because at the end of the day, it's the choice you make, you know, as you walk into the voting booth, or what your heart says, etc. So I thought that I did my homework very well, but, you know, to be honest, on the day of the elections at 8 p.m. when the results started coming in, I was so disappointed. I was disappointed in people who still managed to sell their votes. I was disappointed that people are still have this instinct of fear. You know, they're being watched, or they'll be punished if they vote otherwise. And but on the other hand, I tried to come up with some excuse why people acted out in the way they acted out. And so what literally happened, that, you know, with the over 500,000 voters, it was already, you know, known what would be the results. It was just a matter of the rest. But also there were some claims that the machine, the so-called the machine that was used by the CEC was programmed way in advance, determining what kind of results should be already. I know Azim doesn't agree, but, you know, they will have our own arguments about that as well. So it's just, I think there were so many arguments and so many facts that caused for 12 political parties, or at least 5 of them, to come out on the day on October 5th. And it wasn't the idea, you know, to get rid of, let's say, president, or to get rid of the prime minister. The only demand, at least as one of the political parties that went out to protest, was just to express a disagreement with the results of the elections. And I think what happened after that, I think both of my fellow friends kind of laid out very well in the chronological order as well. But what is happening now, at least, you know, what makes, I think, more or less the situation is better, that today the first hearing of the Constitutional Committee took place, and they approved 3 changes in the election system. One of them is that they will eliminate this Form 2 at all from the elections at all. They've already lowered the so-called collateral from 5 million to 1 million soms. And the third one is that they've lowered the threshold from 7% to 3%. But it's a first hearing, so we have to still understand that there's a second and third, and plus the general hearing that should take place with the participation of all MPs as well. So, but we don't know how they will play out later on. It's always unpredictable.
Let me thank you here. This is a remarkable sort of insider set of observations and reminiscences, and very valuable. This will, I'm sure, when the history of these days gets written, it will be firsthand impressions by people like you, who will figure prominently in the sources. So someone who has been watching the issue of corruption, which you have raised very eloquently, Zarina, is Johan Engvall, who is with us, and I welcome your observations on this series of events that began to unfold on October 4th.
Thank you, Dr. Starr. Yeah, since I cannot compete with these distinguished panelists regarding the knowledge about what is going on right now in Kyrgyzstan, I will offer maybe 2 broader generic aspects that I thoughts on two aspects. Let's call them society and state. And if I start with the state, with society, I think that there's been quite a lot of talk about these events as an intergenerational struggle in a way. The young generation here coming up against the old political elite here. And for sure, I agree that this dimension is there, but also sooner or later this old Soviet-formed elite, if you want it, will be out. So rather than this intergenerational struggle, I would see the most fundamental aspect for the future development is rather this intra-generational struggle within this new young generation, if you define it broadly. On the one hand, you can see there is this, as Azim also talked about in the beginning, about the peaceful protests and all that. You know, there's a young yet educated, predominantly urban class here, centered around Bishkek. Here you have activists, people working in NGOs, but also these grassroots movements that you have seen now the last years here. Basically what is often referred to as civil society. Yeah? And they played a key role here in initiating these protests and after the election and demanded new elections. But they also raised demands for political and economic reforms, and they want an end to corruption. So basically they want something new for the country, and they oppose the old political class mostly, I would say. So this movement is more bottom up in that sense, that the people sustaining it or making it up here do not fall, I see, as much under these traditional patron-client relations where people are mobilized much more by specific political leaders, which have been very dominant in the past. But still, in the bigger picture, this civil society only represents a small, mostly urban part of this younger generation. And Kyrgyzstan is still predominantly a rural society. And here you also have a very different, you say, young generation, who also have their frustrations and grievances, but also their own ideas on hopes for how the country should move forward, and which leaders maybe that could help them in this regard. So, and they were also taking part in this past week's events, and ultimately maybe I should say, it's possible to say that they emerged also as the winners here when the dust had settled here, and Zadir Japarov had been confirmed as prime minister and acting president. They were dancing on the streets here. So for them, it seemed to be a real revolution for them. This was their revolution. So my point is that both sides here, I think, needs to be remembered. And the problem in Kyrgyzstan, as elsewhere in the world, of course, is the tendency for people to live in parallel worlds, when they're quite weakening connection, communication, or understanding between different parts of society. And this, of course, has been strengthened with social media. You can see only in Sweden, where I live, where people, they create these bubbles, where you talk to people who think as you do. They view the world in a similar manner, but they also get the information from the same sources. So when we broadly think, when we broadly refer to this new generation and think of the activists in Bishkek as the future, I think we get a distorted picture here of what is a very complex part of society here. So there are other young people coming with very different values and perspectives. And given that none of these groups are likely to disappear, they all have to live in the country together and find some ways to get along. So I think it's necessary for new political movements and new parties also to try to seek broader dialogue if you're going to reform movements and things like that, where these different grievances that I talked about, different experiences and ideas also are listened to, and if you include voices from different regions, urban voices, rural voices, perhaps people would even be surprised how similar some of these frustrations are, really, you know. Or perhaps they could serve as a realization that, you know, of how differently people perceive things. I don't know, but this is my point on this aspect. But turning to the state and the political order here, I remember many years ago I was sitting in the office of the now deceased Kyrgyz politician Melis Shimkhanov, who had back then been elected member of parliament. So I don't remember what I asked him about, but it was something about general, probably about reforms and all that. But I remember his answer. When people want to become private entrepreneurs rather than customs officials, then we will have succeeded. I think this still, I think this struggle is very much ongoing and even highlighted in the most dramatic fashion, maybe with the recent parliamentary elections and this mention about Matraimov and that. But to my mind, then, the role of the state, I think, is still crucial for understanding these developments over the past decades in Kyrgyzstan. Many researchers and experts, they focus on this aspect, and they have documented, you know, that state weakness is a problem here in Kyrgyzstan, especially when it comes to providing public goods and services. Yeah. So the main thing always blamed then tend to be corruption. Yeah. But rather than just seeing corruption in terms of dysfunctional behavior, yeah, or that it's just a distortion of formal institutions and rules, yeah, I think it's also worth thinking about it the other way around, how it works as an alternative system in a way that also keeps the state together. So corruption is more than just about greed. Yeah, it also serves as a legitimizing factor, you can say, a way of keeping support from the elite and the bureaucracy. Yeah? And I think perhaps you can think of it in terms of a parallel to a franchise system, yeah, where public office can be understood as, you know, you acquire the license here to collect corrupt revenues from a particular office, yeah, in exchange for sharing these, but also for loyalty. Yeah? So if you look at it this way, it's also more easier, I think, to understand why corruption is so difficult to get rid of, not just in Kyrgyzstan, everywhere. Because like so many other, how to say, social practices, corruption is strongly dependent on how people basically perceive, perceptions of how widespread it is. So, for example, if I am a customs official, yeah, and I think that, or I probably know that most or all of my colleagues are corrupt, yeah, it doesn't make any sense for me at all to be the only one who does not take bribes. Yeah, it will not change anything about how the system works. It will only make me and my family worse off compared to those who participate in this. So, of course, then the problem is that this system is unfair and generate resentment. Yeah, it means that there is very little in terms of these basic public goods, yeah, supplied by the state. It tends to be private goods in that sense. But if the state is not providing these, also I think there will always be this demand for alternative suppliers to come in here, and it can be local strongmen, as you have seen in Kyrgyzstan now, maybe even criminal authorities, or I think also religious institutions will play a role. But there is also, I would say, a question of representation. When this access to this type of system becomes more monopolized and fewer interests are allowed to take part, the risk of instability increases, I would say. And this, I think, has been the constant dynamic in Kyrgyzstan ever since the days of Akayev. And then maybe finally, to help avoiding this, I mean, there might be some simple institutional solutions, especially this that was with the problem with the threshold to the parliament, for instance, 7%, which I think that, and that's also discussed, and I think that would be very important to lower that threshold in order to avoid this repeat of what happened on October 4th, yeah, when, I don't know, more than 1/3 of the votes was basically wasted, yeah, without representation, because there were so many parties who didn't make it. A final thing that I think might be worth discussing is, at least in my view, is the presidency. I mean, it's probably possible that Kyrgyzstan is still waiting for the emergence here of a strong leader who could stand above the internal divisions and serve as a stabilizing figure. We'll see maybe if Sadir Japarov is that man. I like to give people a chance, but so we'll see. But I have my doubts. However, at the least, I'm very skeptical about the current solution with the president serving only one period. That means that today the president is basically a lame duck from the start. Yeah, no really incentives to do anything. Just thinking about maybe leaving safely or his legacy. I think this was the major problem with the Jeenbekov, who never took any initiatives, never was perceived, that's my impression when I talk to people, extremely elusive as a leader, yeah, which was a big problem in all of this. And at the same time, you know, even if this problem exists, the presidential office is still the ultimate political prize and of very strong symbolical value. But I think it has had, rather than a stabilizing effect, it has rather been polarizing in Kyrgyzstan. So maybe it's worth considering going to a fully parliamentary system. Just an idea. But I heard now the acting president, he talked about that it will take at least 25, 30 years more before people are ready for this system. So we will see, but I think it could be introduced quicker. So my main reflection. Thank you.
Thank you for very, very insightful and provocative observations. We turn now to a person who is uniquely qualified to speak about the important impact of social media and by all the new avenues of exchange on the events in Kyrgyzstan. He's an insider in that world. He knows it intimately. Talant, Sultanov, we're very glad to have your thoughts on these matters.
Thanks so much, Dr. Starr, for kind introduction and for this opportunity to join this distinguished panel to address a very, I see the diverse attendance group, a very experienced group. Well, I'd like to add to the discussion of my observations from the digital standpoint, from technological standpoint, as someone who has been advocating for this digital transformation in the country for the past several years. And I admit, I used to think digital transformation and technologies are panacea for all the sins in the country. But now I realize that technology is just a tool which can be used for the good or for the bad. And these elections have actually shown that. So what happened on the election day, when you came to the voting polls, what you would do is you have to scan your fingerprints. That would allow you to get into the voting station. And then once you fill your sheet, you would put it in the automatic reading machine. So right after the election closes at 8 p.m., practically the results are almost certainly known. And in the past, in the past couple of elections, national elections, these technologies had such big trust among the voters and among the politicians. So when the results were announced, nobody would dispute them. However, because previously you would have such approaches as ballot stuffing and what we call the carousels, where same people go around and vote several times. But unfortunately, this time, even these new technologies did not help gain public trust. And there were a lot of misconceptions. People thought that cameras are watching over them to see how they are putting the marks because they collected money, as Zarina mentioned some of the methods. So how it all unfolded before the elections. I'm very proud that many of our, not many, but a couple of our CAMCA fellows were brave enough to participate as candidates. Some of the CAMCA speakers from Kyrgyzstan were also candidates. They joined different parties and we can hear their insights. There is a very interesting publication that's done annually. International Republican Institute publishes the poll of opinions, survey opinion of public opinion, which shows which are the best, what are the most effective channels of communication for the public. And we can see how TV, radio, print media are all declining very quickly, but the role of the internet and the social media and the messenger is increasing very rapidly. And I think this has shown some promise, especially for young parties that have no members with deep pockets, that using the new technologies they could gain votes for in these elections. And maybe this was the miscalculation, because as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, there are these social media bubbles, and we are unfortunately living in Bishkek in urban settings, are in a bubble. We think everybody thinks the same way we do, but in reality, if you go to the provinces, to the regions, people are thinking completely differently. And there was an article just a couple of days ago, and I was really surprised that so there is a Facebook page of followers of Sadir Japarov, who is now the acting president and prime minister, and it's actually it has the largest following in the Kyrgyz Facebook, 130,000 followers, and I never knew about the existence of this page. So it just shows how these bubbles are so kind of prevalent. Another very interesting development, I think, during the election period was the rise of digital media. Unfortunately, the regular TV stations were very much, I think, biased, and people would turn to online TV stations to get the news. Opposition TV stations would broadcast through the internet. There is one, how to say, maybe TV channel called Context, and it comes out maybe every 2-3 months, but it's so popular, and it actually is done by our speaker here, Azimov. He provides very good analysis, and everybody just loves watching these issues. There was a rise of investigative journalists online, showing all these corruption schemes, and an interesting phenomena, these homemade V-bloggers also came into prominence, and some of them have become prominent politicians and now members of the cabinet, thanks to their active video blogging from the kitchens. Another interesting phenomenon was also use of different online crowdfunding technologies, and one of the young parties managed to raise the necessary deposit of $5 million by crowdfunding, by collecting $1, $10 from regular citizens in Kyrgyzstan, outside of Kyrgyzstan, and this just showed how citizens with little contributions can make an impact. But unfortunately, also there were negative aspects of the social media and internet, is the fake news, the conspiracy theories, and even I was a figure in one of these conspiracy theories, although I was very apolitical this time, but still kind of got to witness it personally. And another interesting aspect is, with all this talk about digital development and transformations for so many years in Kyrgyzstan, some of the processes are still old-fashioned. So one of the scandals can be very illustrative. When the political parties were submitting documents to be registered for elections, these kind of submissions were recorded by hand into some kind of paper, and when one of the political parties allegedly submitted documents after the deadline, there was a huge scandal that they missed the deadline, but people managed to correct this little piece of paper with a pen. So we are still kind of with one foot in new technologies, with another foot in old-fashioned practices. And I'd like to conclude now with this third part of my contribution, is what happened right after the elections. I think after October 4th, there was big protest mobilization through social media. There was already experience of peaceful rallies called reaction to what the government is doing. And this, as Azim mentioned in his introduction, helped gather this urban liberal youth to the main square, but of course then it turned into something different. And the night after that, another very interesting aspect is digital resilience and communications reliability. On October 5th in the evening, the communications were shut down. So you could not use mobile phone. And if you were staying at home, you didn't know what was happening in the main square. And only after 3 a.m. or I think 4 a.m. in the morning, it was turned up again. And I was trying to watch the news from the TV, and it reminded me the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, and I would turn on my black and white TV set, and there was only 3 or 4 channels, and in every channel you were watching Swan Lake. That was very surprising. Why? Same was in the Kyrgyz TV on the night of October 5th. Every channel was showing concert and nothing about the protests happening in the streets. An interesting aspect was the troll factories. As our previous speakers mentioned, and especially Almaz, it was a roller coaster of events happening every day after the October 4th. And there was massive public opinion forming, public opinion making efforts by the trolls, by the real opinion makers. And it was very interesting to see how the internet and new technologies were used to form the public opinions. One of the, I think, positive aspects of using the social media internet was volunteer mobilization to help protect the safety and security of the citizens. And I'm very proud that our CAMCA fellows took the lead in organizing such volunteers. Aziz Abakirov, Azamat Akilev, and others were every night kind of on the streets helping kind of protect the safety. And I'd like to conclude with last point about the future. I think Zarina mentioned that there are major efforts in the parliament now to make it possible for the young parties, for the youth to participate in the elections. And also a very interesting remark came from the Prime Minister, who said that we should use the blockchain technology to make sure that there will be trust in the next election round. I don't know exactly what he means, but for me as a digital development person, it's very heartwarming to see the leaders of the country use all these new fashionable high technology terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an extraordinary collection of observations and insights. I searched the web very widely, and frankly, nothing has compared with what you all have just offered in terms of knowledge and specific information plus wisdom. So let us turn to we've been talking as clinicians. If I can use a medical analogy, we've been all walking around and poking and testing and finding out what happened and what's going on as clinicians. Well, that's only the first of 3 processes. The second is a diagnosis, and each of you has offered some very interesting diagnostic insight. That's number 2, but number 3 is what we want to turn to now: prescription. What do you think the patient needs at this point? The polity of the patient being the polity of Kyrgyzstan. Let me ask each of you, just for 1 or 2 things that you think are the key steps that will move this process forward in a constructive manner. Azim, can we turn to you first?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Starr. So one of the main takeaways from these current events have been, and one of the differences that made this revolution, forceful takeover, coup, stand out and look different from 2 previous revolutions, is that all the political actors have tried to keep the events going in the judicial plane, meaning that they wanted always to legitimize it and keep it, well, if not legal, but at least legitimate, or the other way, if not legitimate, but at least legal. And so what we're seeing right now is that Sadir Japarov, who is now head of the government and head of the state at the same time, even though they did not enjoy the support of the international community when struggling for the power, right now we're seeing the efforts of the government and the president's administration to actually get the recognition back. So we have seen the newly appointed Minister of International Affairs, who asked international community to actually ask them for cooperation and for financial support, to be frank, to keep the government going. And so this seems to be one of the one of the aspects that give us, well, some sort of optimism for the future, because even though some of the ways that Sadir Japarov got his way are questionable, still they're trying to now keep it all legal and legitimate, and not be, stranded, but to be in the international community to seek for the support of their partners. And if we talk about prescription, then we should remember that the trigger to this whole process that we are witnessing right now have been the election that some part of the population were dissatisfied with. And so since now the parliament is looking at changes into the election law, so I think one of the prescriptions is actually to do what Zarina has mentioned in her remarks, is actually let more political pluralism take place in Kyrgyzstan. Let more political parties come in. Do not allow very limited oligarchic or very privileged political groups to concentrate the whole power and all the resources in their hands, but actually to let kind of steam out in a way that by sharing power, by being accountable to the system of checks and balances, and by allowing more people to take part in decision making. So for now, in this period of volatility and uncertainty that we're living in, I think playing the game by the rules that are widely supported by most of the actors seems to be the better way that can help reach the political consensus.
Thank you very much. Zarina, your thoughts?
I think, today they set the Central Election Commission set the date for the parliamentary elections, which would be December 20th. So whether or not people want or not, the elections must take place. We need to have a parliament, because at the end of the day, we are a parliamentary country, right? And within this period before the elections, the current acting president, the current officials who've been appointed for the last few days, to be honest, they have this period of time to prove that they're worth of that trust placed on them by the people, because at the end of the day, people, at least I think a lot of people, believe that the Sadir Japarov has been put out there as a leader and by the people. So if we keep assuming that he is representing people, and at the end of the day we are still a small country with the economy was hit very badly throughout the pandemic, and we still facing this challenge of and the fear that the second wave is on its way. We need to keep that in mind as well. We need to keep in mind the winter is coming. I mean, we have lots of other issues, so-called house issues that that they need to look out for too. I mean, in addition to this political process as well. So it's, to be honest, it's actually some sort of like experiment plus test, I think, for the current leadership to do the right things in order to meet all the expectations and hopes, put by people. And if so, it's just matter of for them to do the right things or actually fail. So they have no choice of failing. So they have to, as Azim mentioned, play by rules. Plus, they need to demonstrate that the protests and the disagreement of people were worth of all these things. And to be honest, sometimes I'm afraid of putting my phone away for 5 minutes, because by the time when you come back and you look out for news, then something new happened, the new appointment, and you're like, oh my God, it was only 5 minutes ago. It's like keeping up with all the changes that are currently taking place. Some of them are good, some of them are not that good, but it's like a give and take, and you think maybe in order to reach this long-term goal, maybe we have to go through all these pitfalls as well, with some of the appointments that, we don't necessarily agree. But we need to also, one of the huge lessons learned, I think during these elections, was that there's a huge gap between Bishkek city, between the capital, between the population living in Bishkek city and the rest of the country. Education-wise, it's way different. There's this huge gap, of generational gap, to be honest, that was left out on its own, that's not educated, that has totally different principles and values compared to those who are, like us in Bishkek, and, have all this comfort around us, and we think internationally, we think globally, we think about globalization, etc., and we think about different things compared to the majority of the population, in our country. So I think for the leadership and for new people who will come into the parliament, it has to be something that should be prioritized. Like, very highly, that education has to be restructured, reformed, and brought up to a different level. And Almaz, I think, left the chat. I wanted to congratulate him since he was appointed as the new Minister of Education. He has a lot on his plate as well, but I understand he won't make any changes overnight. But there are things that need to be restructured, and maybe they have to destroy it and start in a new format. But at the end of the day, I think it's a good test, and it's very unpredictable. And it's just, as we say, we hope that, the right things will take place. And if things like what happened today, that, the parliament, despite the fact that the current parliament is still comprises of people from this, the big parties, agreed by 85 out of 120 agreed to all those 3 changes, which is a good start. But
Good.
We still have other.
The advice to do the right thing could be applied globally. I like it. Johan Engvall.
Yes, thank you. I just agree basically on the previous 2 speakers. Good recommendations there. First, this aspect of keeping it within the legal framework that Azim pointed out is worth emphasizing again, I think. And especially then turning to the elections, I think will be important, and especially to ensure representation that is fair and inclusive. I think that is very important in Kyrgyzstan, that the different interests and different regions and all that will have their place here. And I think previous elections have shown that when this is upset, or even when presidents go in particular directions, that is not a good sign. But I don't think only this aspect of representation is enough. I think also that you need to focus on this basic aspects of building responsive state institutions, basically, that can also be accountable, and because if you don't have that aspects in place, there will always be this and with a highly corrupt system, political competition and all that will also mean that there will be also very big competition over corruption. So I see this basic aspect of state building, and to still have a value in Kyrgyzstan to make sure that that there are for people that other alternative sources and this type of unrest will be minimized. The final thing maybe was, I think, what Zarina said there about, which I think is a good point, that Kyrgyz politics is about more than just Bishkek, and to have this broader dialogue maybe that I talked about earlier. I think otherwise this gulf here between regions and between urban and rural will only widen, and I think there will be a need also to find compromises, not and of course education system is a key point here, and there are problems now with an even younger generation coming up here who have been raised by grandparents and with parents working abroad and things like that to take care of. But I think it's not just about dismissing these people either as uneducated or backward. I think that will not cut it either. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a big difference, as you're suggesting, between state building and building of personal empires, and that may be the key. Talant Sultanov, please.
The short answer is there is no magic pill. The little bit longer answer is that I agree with the previous speakers. I think education is the key. One illustration I wanted to bring is during these protest times, in some days you would have several protests or rallies in the same day in different places. For example, supporters of Sadr Japarov would be rallying in the old square, supporters of ex-president Atambayev rallying in the other place, and supporters of Babanov in the third place. And there was one rally which was much smaller but more vocal. Is young people decided to rally against corruption and the organized crime. And I decided, and you could watch all these rallies online with the help of these journalists who were there streaming live. But I decided to join the young people who were rallying against the corruption and organized crime. And I was very surprised to find two of my students who took my class on public policy. And they said, after this class, we realized the importance of going and voting and the importance of participating in political processes. Because a lot of people actually did not vote because they didn't believe their votes would matter. So I think one, we need to encourage everybody actually come and vote, and two, educate them so that they have the critical thinking and understanding of what the politicians are really offering, so that they don't make choices just because of administrative reform, administrative pressures, resources, or just because somebody is giving them money.
Thank you very, very much. I personally consider it a great honor to have been present for these presentations. They've really just been excellent and very, very thoughtful. I'm left with a very curious impression. I would never have expected going into this meeting that one of the key words to come out of it is education. And maybe we're biased by the fact that our friend and colleague Beishenaliev is now Minister of Education, but I don't think that is the cause of it. I think you've all identified a division that exists in the country, which, by the way, is not unique in any sense to Kyrgyzstan. It's very important to remember that. But in this division, not rural and urban, but people who are living really in different eras. And the only way to bridge it is information and education. And this, as I think about this, I think, look at the huge population growth of Bishkek in the last generation. Old Frunze was a small and rather quiet place, definitely small. It's now, what, tripled in size since independence, and that means that half or 2/3 of the population has intimate ties with the rest of the country, with the countryside. Maybe we need to be thinking about how does one activate these links and engage people who haven't been engaged in both directions. Anyway, my impression from your excellent and very thoughtful presentations, frankly, is very positive. Zarina has given us some very sober observations from the trenches, and the rest of you have too. There are things certainly to be very deeply concerned about. On the other hand, the bottom line, it seems to me, is that there is something positive and constructive lurking through under all this, and which may or may not come out in the coming days. We'll see. Meanwhile, I thank you all very, very much. I want to announce that the Central Asia-Caucasus Institute and the CAMCA network, both, have teamed up with the Strasbourg Policy Center to issue the second volume of its Central Asia, the Caucasus in the post-COVID-19 era. That's just out, it's online, you can see it. And I want also, in conclusion, to say there'll be further events of this sort. We cover all of the region, and we have equally impressive and talented and active fellows in the other countries. We will engage them and hope that this becomes an avenue for a big audience. But in conclusion again, the word civic education is certainly a theme that this great adventure that is ongoing in Bishkek and in the rest of Kyrgyzstan. Civic education, that's what's going on. We'll just see whether it steps forward, as several of you have suggested it could become, or if it's no progress or even a step back. But time to put civic education front and center in our discussion about policy, both within the country, but also internationally. It's time to stop thinking about Kyrgyzstan in all these caricatured ways that Azimov touched upon at the very beginning, and realize that this is a significant developing country with a remarkably talented group of people in the modern sector who are moving ahead, and they need whatever backing and support time.